When we create or hear music, we're hearing it as a string of events that sounds like musical tension either being generated or resolved. Musical tension is again our perception of a note or a group of notes moving to another note or a group of notes that is either less or more stable than the previous one. The term tendency tones describes how this phenomenon works. Now, being as fundamental as it is, you'd think it was pretty important to learn. But as guitar players, we're pretty busy with the minor pentatonic scale, and sometimes we skip over the more important stuff. Welcome back to the channel. My name's Chris. Today you will learn about tendency tones. Now, tendency tones again just describes this phenomenon of generating and resolving musical tension. The way I like to see this, though, is that these notes that we hear, and then the next set of notes that we hear, is really moving from a stable sound to an unstable sound when we're creating tension, or moving from a very unstable sound to a stable sound. That's resolving tension, right? That's how we work auditorily. That's what we're hearing. Now, you can look up tendency tones on the internet. You can go to Wikipedia. You can buy some books and see how people describe it and see all the stuff. We're going to do it ourselves. We're going to put a scale on the neck and we're going to explore tendency tones together on the instrument, right? Forget about the papers and the books and all that stuff. Let's put it on the neck where it belongs. Before we get started, if you're enjoying this channel, you like the style with which I teach, you'd like some more content, some more in-depth time with me, consider joining my Patreon page. It's through my Patreon page that you can get access to my teaching platform called The Studio. And in The Studio, I'm interacting with guitar players all the time. I'm posting regular assignments, I host live Q&A sessions, and I also teach in-depth 4-week courses on specific subjects like triads, the major scale, the pentatonic scale. So if you'd like to support the channel, or you're really ready to understand how this instrument works and you'd like to work with me, check out my Patreon page, join me in The Studio, and if you do decide to support the channel, I look forward to working with you. Okay, tendency tones, again, is a term that we use to describe relationships between notes. So here's a good example. Here's a note. We don't have any relationship, so it's just sitting there. As soon as we introduce another note, we're going to set up a relationship. And this note is going to have a character in relationship to that new note. That new note is going to be this one. Whether we understand it cognitively or not, auditorily, right, from a standpoint of hearing, we all want to hear that. In this context, this note is going to have a tendency to want to move to that note. So that's how we describe tendency, right? It's all about relationships. We're going to use this as our context and explore the idea of tendency together. We're not going to use books or charts or Wikipedia. We're just going to listen to these notes and we're going to put a few rules in front of us to see what kind of tendency we can uncover here. Here's our A major scale. I'm going to put the numbers of this scale down, right? These are just the scale degrees. 1, root, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then back to the root again. It doesn't matter what notes are in this scale. This is a major scale, so no matter where we put it, the tendencies that we're going to find in this structure are going to be the same for any key. Here it is, A major. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to put the root of the scale on the G string, and I'm going to use this A string as the root to drone against all the notes in the scale. And we're going to just listen. And the thing we're listening for is stability versus instability. You could describe this as tension and release. You could describe it as gravitational pull. Which one of the notes sounds like it has more tension or is less stable, right? And that way we're going to uncover if these notes want to move, if we want to hear something different. So here's the root and the root together. That's pretty darn stable. In fact, this frequency is so stable, we largely hear these notes as the same. That's why they're both called A. Super stable, no tendency to do anything else, right? As soon as we move anywhere, it's that stability is gone. So the root, very, very stable. It's a stable note. Okay, we're going to go to the second note of the scale now. Now that sounds less stable to me. Right? So this is unstable. And what we want to hear really is this. Right? Unstable, stable. This note, this second note in the scale, is going to have a tendency to want to move. But as you can see right here, the 2 is also really close to the 3. Let's just check that out. Well, that sounds really nice. So maybe it should resolve here. Well, listen to the resolution of this versus this. This note, this second note, as we've just found out, not using any science or anything, just our ears, really wants to resolve back to the root. The second has a tendency to want to move back to the root. Okay, let's check the third out. Here's our third note in the scale. Well, it sounds really nice. Largely, we can all agree that the third, the major third, is a sweet sounding interval. Sounds pretty stable. Let's check the notes around the third, in other words, the second and the fourth, to see if they're less or more stable than the third. Here's the second. We already know that this wants to go down, so this is less stable than this, right? That third is pretty stable. But let's check the 4 right above it. It's only a half step away. Let's see what happens. Well, that sounds like it generates even more tension. So the third, the 2 notes around it are less stable than it is. So we're going to call this a stable note. The third doesn't have a tendency to move, just like the root. Stable, right? Let's go to the 4 and see what happens. We just heard this. Listen to this. Lots of instability compared to the third. I can already tell that that's what's going to want to happen. And usually half steps generate an enormous amount of tension. So I'm just using my brain and my ears to say, I'll bet you anything 4 has a tendency to want to go to 3. But let's just check 4 to 5, since they're also next to each other. Well, that sounds pretty good. That sounds pretty good. But which sounds more of a release? This half step dumps out more tension than a whole step does. So the 4 has a tendency to want to move to the 3. Let's check out the 5. And right off the bat, this sounds stable to me. Let's check the notes around it and see if they're more stable or less stable. Now we already know that that 4 really pulls down to the 3. So I would say the 5 is more stable than the 4. Let's check the 6. Oh my goodness. That's a lot more tension than the 5. So since the 5 has 2 notes around it that are less stable than it is, it doesn't have a tendency to move. We're happy with this, right? We like this sound. It's a stable sound. Let's check out the 6. Lots of suspension, lots of instability. Sounds great when we dump it back down to the 5. But let's just check the 7 because they're right next to each other. Whoa, too much tension, right? This is even more tension. So the 6 really wants to resolve back to the 5. Right? Let's check the 7, even though we pretty much know what's going to happen here. Super tension. And it's going to want to resolve up to the root. But let's just check the 6 just to make sure. Well, that sounds nice. But that sounds like what the tendency would be. In this relationship and in this context, we want to hear that note move up a half step. So let's just review. Root, stable. Second, wants to move down to the root. Third, stable. Fourth, wants to move down to the third. Fifth, stable. Sixth, wants to move down to the 5. And And 7 obviously wants to move up to the root. So as you may have noticed, there are different levels of stability and instability in these tendencies. So we're going to use some color just to put on these notes and these relationships to see where the real hotspots are. The root, the third, and the fifth are all stable. I'm going to color those green. We're good, right? Perfectly fine. The 2 has a whole step resolution down to the root. It's a pretty mild resolution, but it definitely has a tendency. I'm going to color those blue. The 4 has a half step resolution. Listen to the amount of tension here. And release. I'm going to color that relationship red. The 5, we already know, is stable, but the 6 has a whole step resolution down to the 5. It's very soft. I'm going to color that one blue. The 7 has a lot of tension. I'm going to color that one red. So here's some interesting information, right? We've got stable notes, and we've got some level of soft instability, and we've got really harsh movement. Big tendency here and here, right? It just so happens that all of the notes that want to move to these 3 notes. The root, the third, or the fifth. The root, the third, and the fifth just happen to be the notes of our major triad. So these are really the gravitational center of the scale, and specifically the root and the third both have these half-step movements towards them. So they're really sort of like the real gravitational centers of the scale. And that fifth, still stable, but with a much softer movement toward it. That's what tendency is all about. Okay, so there's tendency tones. We just looked at a single set of relationships and methodically went through and talked it through and listened to the sounds, right? Don't need to study a lot of stuff. Just put these ideas on the fretboard and explore them. These types of things really build your musicianship, much more than your technical capability. But it's that musicianship in combination with your technical capability that define your overall capability as a musician. So it's good to balance these things, right? Technical stuff and theoretical stuff. Tabs for this lesson, as well as every lesson on this channel, are available on my Patreon page, as is access to my teaching platform. I hope you found this helpful. I hope you found it interesting. Stay curious. I'll see you next time.